Okay.
I'm going to play 4 audios during this thing, so hoping it goes.
Okay. I'm gonna stop my video.
My sound working okay?
Yeah, it's great.
Okay.
I'm gonna go off audio now and just go. I'll use the chat to communicate with you. Okay.
Yep. Hey everyone, it's good to see you all tonight. Hopefully you can see me. Just going to wait a couple more minutes here, probably till 7:05 to get started. But just checking out the audio capabilities here and just making sure my screen's working okay. So appreciate that. Yep, you're. I can't see any of you, Leslie. No, I cannot. But I know you're out there because I see numbers of people that are on here. There's like 350 people on Zoom at the moment. I would love to see a screen that has 350 faces on it. That would be awesome. I would really dig on that. That would be like kind of the thing that would like become a mural or something like that. So glad you're all here. Just you got another couple minutes to grab a glass of wine or some pretzels or get your chair all comfortable, whatever you want. The sun has gone behind a cloud out here at the perfect timing outside the window outside. I have a window right by my desk down here in the kind of work area that I've established here in the lower level of our house. And it's gone out there, just gone away exactly at the right time so that I don't have it in my eyes. Going to get started here in probably like 2 minutes, folks. 2 minutes. Welcome tonight. Really glad to have you here. I don't know, just doing stuff, just getting my stretches going. Joan's asking if I've gotten my cookies. I have gotten some cookies. It is true. Midnight Cookie did come through for me, and they're good. They're good. You know, I've also really come to appreciate Oreos in this time of coronavirus. Oreos, I don't know. There's something like they have just the right amount of chocolate and sweetness. I don't know. They're just really, they're good. They're good stuff. Okay, 1 minute. Still answering emails of people who you know, are just trying to still get in. I get lots of emails from folks on the day of the lectures. So, all right, let's get rolling here. I'm going to pop off my chat so I don't see any more chat here. Going to get going. Welcome tonight to the first lecture in a series, 2 lectures called How Joe Biden Can Win. Really glad to have you here. Thanks for joining these kind of remote lectures. I know that they're not exactly identical to the experience of being at Kane Hall or being in person at some venue. But I appreciate the flexibility and the chance to put these together. They're always really helpful for me to kind of work through my thoughts and my thinking. And in this case, in these two lectures in particular, it's been extremely helpful for me to kind of figure some things out or assess where I'm at. And I appreciate your flexibility. I know that for some of you, the technology that we're using tonight, Zoom, and then watching on YouTube is not what you do normally. And so I appreciate that. Many more of you will be watching this also in a recorded capacity. So glad to have you join it. I want to start with 3 things before I kind of bounce into my lecture. And very quickly here, I'll be putting up my PowerPoint slides and you'll all be able to see those. But I want to speak to you, just kind of me to you for a few minutes to start us off. The way this lecture, or I'm going to try to do it, is I will speak to you directly so I can see you and you can see me at different portions of the lecture. I'll do it at the beginning. There'll be moments along the way where I'll stop and talk to you, and then there'll be some Q&A at the end where I'll do this. But most of the time, I will be using my PowerPoint slides, and that will occupy your screen. I'll be sharing my screen so you can see those, and you'll be hearing my voice as a voiceover for that. So that's the way most of this will go. At the end of it all, if there's time, we'll do. The plan is to do some Q&A for folks who are on Zoom, and that would be in the Q&A box for Zoom. All right, 3 things I want to say here as a kind of opening bit to this. First of all, Joe Biden was not my candidate for president. I will be voting for a Democrat for the presidency in 2020, and Joe Biden. I wasn't opposed to Joe Biden at all, but he wasn't my top candidate. He wasn't even in my top 5. I would say my ordering kind of went something like Senator Kamala Harris, Senator Cory Booker, Cabinet Member Julian Castro, and then maybe somewhere between Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar. And then maybe Joe Biden was in there somewhere. I certainly wasn't opposed to him, but he wasn't my candidate. And I have felt my job during this election from the beginning has been to get to a position of support for anybody. That was part of what was important for me to do, given who I want to be in this election, and also given my ability to talk to others about the candidates. So I come to this lecture tonight having kind of worked to the process of what I would call kind of getting to strong support of a particular candidate. And so he wasn't the person, but I have, identified a series of things and things that I think are useful to pay attention to that could help him that could be valuable for Joe Biden to win. And so I'm going to be talking about some of those tonight. Second, I want to right off the bat, bring up the fact that there is an outstanding set of allegations against Joe Biden involving sexual harassment and sexual assault from the early 1990s. Those allegations are really quite serious if they're true. And I always start with the premise that someone wouldn't make up something like this. I start with a kind of sense that there might well be truth to this. So I don't know what's going to come of those. I don't. I will say that there are also some things about the person who's making these allegations that give me some significant pause as well. So I kind of just in a position of agnosticism. I don't know. I do believe that given the way that our system works, that we're probably beyond the legal dimensions of this, but we're of course always in the ethical space. And I'm hoping that that to the extent that there is a there, that this will get unfolded and that this candidate Biden will have to address that and deal with that. So I don't know on that. And I don't at this point in time plan to really delve into that in these lectures because it's just beyond my knowledge, but I don't know. I don't know. These things do happen and really good people do make really bad choices. So I'm hoping that isn't the case. And I'm hoping that eventually this all gets cleared up in some kind of capacity. But I'm also not naive about all of this. That won't be a point of focus in the lectures unless between now and next Monday, something dramatic happens, and it's possible. And third, I do want to say that for this lecture or these 2 lectures, that my goal here is to to help us to analyze and understand the way that the presidential landscape is working, and the dynamics of the dimensions of figuring out how Joe Biden might win the election is what the point is of focus for me for this election. I'm trying to figure it out. The lectures are what I'm trying to understand. And I think that to see how Biden could win this election is really the point of focus for this analysis. So glad you're all here. Welcome tonight. And the goal here is to see how Joe Biden can win in this election. Okay. I'm going to pop on the screen now, share it here. How Joe Biden can win. So I want to talk about kind of 5 defining weeks that really decided the Democratic nomination, the process by which Biden came to emerge as the candidate and what occurred in that span of time. And one of my goals in this lecture is to provide some opportunities for the moments to hear these dimensions as they unfolded. So I will have some audio and some discussion in here of kind of the words of the candidates or of other folks in the window of time. So I want to go back to Iowa City, Iowa in late January of this year. I had the privilege to be there with a whole series of people who traveled with common purpose to understand, to see the candidates in person. And one of the evenings we were there, we went to a podcast episode that was being hosted by John Lovett, who had worked in the Obama administration's White House, and he and Crooked Media colleagues run a podcast that is part of their empire, their work. It's in this particular podcast is called Love It or Leave It, John Love It or Leave It. And this evening he had these hosts, these guests on his show. And the person up in the upper right-hand corner is Michael Moore. And Michael Moore has been a provocateur, has made a number of films about American politics, and was a strong Bernie Sanders supporter in this election. And in this particular episode, which then was posted under this title, Iowa, Don't Fuck This Up, aired on the Monday of the caucuses. The caucuses were that evening. And the reality is that this show was taped on a Thursday night on the 30th, but then aired on the morning of the caucuses. And I want to play just a 1.5-minute long clip here. I'm going to use my phone to play the audio. And it's a moment in time when John Lovett is talking to Michael Moore. And I'm going to hold up the audio here. So this is 28 minutes into the podcast. And so they're having a conversation, and Moore is talking right now about 2016, and then it's going to pivot to 2020.
I think we're all so upset and hurt because Hillary won. She won by 3 million votes. And she can think about this. She won. The Russians threw everything at her. She beat the Russians. Comey, the head of the FBI. I don't want the head of the FBI against me. He threw everything at her. She won. She still got the most votes, no matter what everybody did to her. She lost by 2 votes per precinct in Michigan. 2. This is why this time around, I will be running, whoever is our nominee, I will be running the campaign. And, well, let me ask you this. Sorry.
That's not true. Michael Moore is joking there. He's not going to be running the campaigns. Don't worry. So here we go. This is the most important part here.
Let me ask you this, though. I genuinely, and I feel the same way as you, I can genuinely see the argument for each of the top candidates that are remaining, and I can see myself fighting like hell for each of them. But I know that, the people that listen to this show, based on just even this audience, I know that they lean more towards Warren and Bernie than they do towards Biden. But Biden may be the nominee.
Biden will not be the nominee. Well, no, I know him, and actually he's a really, you obviously have met him. Mm-hmm.
He's a decent and caring person.
Yes. No, I believe that's very true. But we are in a different era now.
And right at the end of that, he says, we are in a different era now. And he's talking about the moment for Joe Biden has passed in Michael Moore's position. Now, I've had a chance to see Moore a couple times in Iowa, and he was a staunch Bernie Sanders supporter. And he dismissed Biden and his chance for Biden throughout every time that Moore would talk. He also was quite disagreeable towards Elizabeth Warren and others. But his position there that Biden will not be the nominee was so definitive in that moment. I remember being there in the audience when he said this, and I just thought, I don't know about that, Michael Moore. I don't know about that. All right. That's in Iowa. We know that what happened after in Iowa is that Joe Biden came in fourth. Bernie Sanders and Pete Buttigieg came in basically tied. Elizabeth Warren was third. Joe Biden was fourth. By the time we got to New Hampshire, which was a week later, Joe Biden was not doing well. He finished fifth in New Hampshire. And so the narrative became pretty easy and clear to people. These are some of the headlines that I've pulled from the different kind of period of time. Joe Biden's presidential campaign is fading, and so is he. You can see these. I don't need to read these as we go through this. These are headlines that are pulled from news stories in this period of time. And by the narrative, I refer to the ways in which news stories begin to sound very similar. The people are saying the same things. Journalists are writing the same thing. This is the narrative. Biden was sinking. He was not going to make it. The wheels were coming off his bus. The boat was sinking. You can pick the metaphor. It wasn't positive. And when we get to this headline, you know that things are not going well for Joe Biden. If this is the headline that Cher says she still believes in Joe Biden, we know that things are not going well for Joe Biden. So he's fourth in Iowa, he's fifth in New Hampshire, and the narrative is it was widespread in news coverage. He was not going to be the nominee. And in fact, there was this quote that David Plouffe, who had been the campaign manager for Barack Obama in 2008, had said to Biden way back in I don't know if it was 2016 when he was considering running in 2016 or if it was before this election, but Plouffe had said to him, and it had become part of the kind of the story of Joe Biden. And Plouffe had said, Vice President, do you really want to end your career in a hotel in Des Moines? All right. Kind of like losing in Des Moines. And so this quote kept kind of going around, and Plouffe is now a commentator for MSNBC. And so it was becoming commonplace. Biden's in trouble. He's going to lose. All right. But then we get 2.5, 3 weeks later, 14 states, Super Tuesday, March 3rd, 2020. And we have this graphic. This is from just slightly past midnight, our time here in Seattle. For Super Tuesday, 14 states, and Biden wins all of these states over on the left. Virginia, North Carolina, Alabama, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Minnesota, Arkansas, Massachusetts, Texas. Maine's too close to call, and Bernie Sanders has won his own state of Vermont. He's won the state of Colorado, Utah, and he's on his way to winning, clearly, California. So, wow, something dramatic changed in there. We moved from Biden going to lose and sinking to Biden wins. All right. And when you win like this, then you get this kind of headline. All right. The resurrection of Joe Biden. And that tagline, that subhead, Wednesday was the start of Lent and Joe Biden gave up losing. Oh man, that's like a dream headline right there. And you can see Joe with his wife, Dr. Jill Biden, right there, celebrating the night in Los Angeles. He was speaking in Los Angeles that evening, the successes of Joe Biden, that no longer was he sinking, the wheels coming off. He was now in front. and he had come back from the dead, using the kind of Jesus-esque reference here. And even Biden's got his kind of arms out in this kind of, figure, this leader, this kind of determined, vociferous energy that he's got. So what happened in that middle of time is what I want to talk about, because what changed in there is essential to understanding how Joe Biden can win this election. That what changed in that 2 to 3 week window after New Hampshire and between that and Super Tuesday is essential to understanding how Biden can win the presidency this year. So I want to identify 4 things that fundamentally changed in that window of time. First, African American voters moved to the front, to the fore, to the front and center in this primary, in this voting. All right, I'm going to talk about that tonight. Second, Joe Biden fused his story with the story of America, the mythic story of America. And every good candidate who's going to win has to do this. You can look at anybody who's become president of the United States, and they have at some point in their campaign fused themselves into the fabric of the story of America. And they've inserted themselves as an example of the best of America, that this is what they do. Even Donald Trump did this when he talked about being an outsider, someone who would fight for Americans, and that he would unrig the system. Like, that's part of the mythology of Americans, of American leaders who are going to work on behalf of the people. Biden fused his story with America, and I want to talk about that in this lecture tonight. And third, the center and center and center left voters coalesced. They came together. They built a coalition in the center of at the heart of the Democratic Party that essentially did what Republicans did not do in 2016. The center and the center left came together and said, not on our watch are we going to allow a candidate that they didn't want to become the nominee to become the nominee. Those body of voters that united were opposed to a Bernie Sanders, particularly, and they came together and coalesced around Joe Biden. And that happened in a very rapid space. And I want to talk about that tonight, and also pivot from that to think about how that coalition works for the coming election. These 3 things are all central to how Joe Biden won the nomination, and these are going to be what I'm going to focus on tonight. A 4th thing that became a big deal in this time window is that the coronavirus and Trump's leadership became the defining issue, the core issue of this election. There was nothing else that mattered anymore. This was it. And that became the dominant discussion in South Carolina in late February, and certainly became important in the Super Tuesday voting. These are a couple examples of things that Trump said late in this time window as this shift was occurring, as this dramatic change was occurring towards Joe Biden. On February 23rd, Donald Trump said, we're very cognizant of everything going on. We have it very much under control in this country. Not remotely true. On February 26th, Trump said 15 people, he's referring to people that have been diagnosed as having COVID-19, 15 people, and within a couple days, it's going to be down to close to 0. And that's a pretty good job we've done. And on February 27th, he said, it's going to disappear. One day, it's like a miracle. It will disappear. And on February 29th, Donald Trump said, we've done a great job. And I've gotten to know these professionals. He's talking about doctors and medical professionals. They're incredible. That's true, by the way. And everything is under control. That's not true. I mean, they're very, very cool. They've done it, and they've done it well. Everything is really under control. These comments by Trump, and today in the Washington Post, a story that points out that I think 10 times in January and February in the daily briefings that Trump has been acknowledged that he doesn't read. 10 times in his daily briefings, there was a discussion about the pandemic and the risks of coronavirus in January and February. while those messages were getting to were there, but he was not receiving them nor acting upon them. He was saying, in fact, quite the opposite, that everything's under control. This dynamic, this reality came to dominate the American political scene. This is so important that I think actually number 4 is worth a whole lecture. So next week, I'm going to talk about coronavirus and Trump's leadership relative to Joe Biden, because it's so important. And I'm quite certain that Biden is not the nominee without any of these 4. But the coronavirus is so important, it deserves an entire lecture. So tonight, these are the 3 that I want to focus on. I want to talk about African-American voters coming to the fore. I want to talk about Joe Biden fusing his story with the American mythic story, the kind of stories we tell about what makes America great. And third, I want to talk about the way in which the center and center left voters coalesced in opposition to kind of the progressive left voters that were more in the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren camp. All right. I call these democratic decisions that were made because they were, of course, were made within the Democratic Party. But they're also democratic in that they've been important for us as a democracy. And I want to start with the reality of the way in which African American voters came to the fore in the primary, in the Democratic Party primary. So after, in Iowa, and in New Hampshire, we were talking about 2 of the whitest states in America. Back in January, when I was doing a series of lectures on the Democratic Party and the way they went through, they were going to go through the primary process, I talked about the grave problems with having 2 of the whitest states in America vote first. You compound that by the fact that in Iowa, very few percentage, about 10% of all Democratic voters participate in the caucuses. So you're talking about a really small percentage of an overwhelmingly white population. In New Hampshire, it's a primary, so you have a lot more voters, but very white still. When you got to Nevada, which was the 3rd state to vote, now we're talking about a decent size of a number of voters of color, about 15% Latinx voters, about 10% African-American voters in the Democratic caucuses there. And then when we get to South Carolina, which is 4th, you're talking about 60% of Democratic voters are African Americans. So they exert a significant weight in the party in the 4th primary. In the broader primary, that is the Democratic Party, and in the broader general election, African American voters are vital. They are really the core of the Democratic Party. They are the base of the Democratic Party. They are about 20 to 25% of all people who vote Democratic each year, and they turn out at very high numbers in the primaries and in the elections. The most consistent population to turn out to vote in elections, in general elections each year in America, are African American women. So we're talking about the core, the base of the Democratic Party. And in South Carolina, this was all going to happen. This was all going to come to the fore. And Bakari Sellers, who lives in South Carolina and whose father, Cleveland Sellers, was part of a group of folks that had been badly beaten. Some of his friends were killed at a rally back in 1968 at South Carolina State. And Cleveland Sellers went to prison for a period of time, even though he was a target in these beatings as opposed to a proponent of them. His son is Bakari Sellers, and Bakari has served in the South Carolina State Legislature. And on February 11th, right after New Hampshire had voted, and there was this and Sellers is a supporter of Biden. He had been a big supporter of Kamala Harris, and after Harris dropped out, he became a very big supporter of Biden. And Sellers tweeted this after New Hampshire voted. He said, "Hey, can y'all chill out with the political obituaries until some black folk have voted? Thanks." And this is the sense in South Carolina of like, hey, this doesn't get real until some African Americans get a chance to weigh in on this primary. And that really happens in Nevada and in South Carolina. So in the Nevada caucuses on February 22nd, a Saturday, Sanders won, and he won going away. He won with 50% of the vote. and Biden came in second at right about 20%. And when you looked at all voters and African-American voters, we saw a couple important things in the Nevada caucuses. We saw that Sanders got almost 50% of the vote. And among African-Americans, Biden won at 39% of the vote. And African-Americans came in, Sanders came in second among African-Americans at 27% of the vote. That number, 27% for Sanders, got a lot of attention in that election. He had also won in that caucuses, had won very strongly among Latinx voters. And so there was this discussion that Sanders had built a coalition that was much more diverse than he had had in 2016. In Nevada in 2016, he had barely, narrowly lost to Hillary Clinton, and he had drawn 23% of African-American voters. And everybody, there was a lot of discussion among analysts and journalists and pundits and political leaders that Sanders getting 27% of African-Americans among a much larger field portended the possibility that he was building his support among Black voters. Combining that with his clear support among Latino voters, there was a sense that Sanders was putting together a diverse coalition, which he had to have, which you have to have if you're going to win the Democratic nomination. Biden still won among African Americans, and that had been seen as kind of quote unquote his firewall. His great support among African American voters was going to be the thing that could put him over the top if he was going to get over the top. But at 39%, it wasn't as great as some people had thought it would be. So the narrative in Nevada was Biden was second, and that's better than he did in Iowa or New Hampshire. And yes, he won African American voters, but Bernie really seems to be rising. And so Bernie that night gave his speech from San Antonio, Texas, which was coming up soon in the near future. And he spoke about the very good chance that he was going to be the nominee. And many in the Democratic Party started to come to terms with the possibility that Bernie Sanders was going to be the Democratic nominee. All right. That's on a Saturday in Nevada. It turns out that 27% that Sanders got represented a high watermark for him among African-American voters. When we go on to South Carolina and then on to Super Tuesday and afterwards, he doesn't grow his support among African-American voters. And as many African-American voters begin to cast their votes, Bernie Sanders does not do better than he did in 2016. And those voters overwhelmingly support Joe Biden. And that's a main part of the story. So let's go to South Carolina. I had the privilege to go with a group of folks to South Carolina. We spent from February 23rd, which was a Sunday, to February 29th, which was a Saturday, and the primary was on that day, the 29th. We spent those days in South Carolina. On the Tuesday of that, which was February 25th, there was a debate in South Carolina. And Biden had a pretty good debate. Klobuchar had a pretty good debate. Elizabeth Warren was not a huge presence in that debate. And Bernie Sanders had a really hard debate. A lot of folks came after him and criticized him. He also got booed by the crowd at one moment. And he kind of got into a little back and forth with a couple audience members around some positions he had. He made some strategic errors that maybe at another point in time we can kind of unpack and talk about. But it was a better night for Biden than for Sanders for sure. The next morning on February 26th, the dean of South Carolina politics, the highest ranking African-American in this country, Jim Clyburn, who is the number 3 person in the House of Representatives behind Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer, a longtime South Carolina congressman. Jim Clyburn endorsed Joe Biden. And it was, I think, the most influential endorsement that I've ever seen in American politics in my lifetime. We have had, presidents endorse previous other folks who are running for office, like Barack Obama recently endorsed Joe Biden, and Ronald Reagan endorsed George H.W. Bush back in 1988. But because of the timing of this endorsement, because of the importance of Clyburn, because of what it ultimately meant for the Sanders, Biden, Warren grouping, this endorsement is in my view, the most important one that I've ever seen. And he gave a speech on the morning of February 26th. It was about 10 minutes long, Clyburn did. And he had Joe Biden there, and Biden, you can't see him in the photo that's here. Biden's off to the left side of this photo, but there were about 15 people behind Clyburn. And I've thought a lot about this, and I think it's important for us to hear all that Clyburn had to say, because in order to understand why African-American voters do have, at least so far, and likely still will, endorse and support Joe Biden at such high levels, I think it's imperative to hear the stories and the way that Clyburn talks about why he's endorsing Joe Biden. So I'm going to play this, and it's about 10 minutes long, which is a long time, but imagine that this is a radio, and we're going to listen to it. And these words are arguably the most important things we're going to hear in this lecture because of what Clyburn had to say and why African-American voters so strongly supported Joe Biden, have supported Joe Biden. So I'm going to play the audio. I can't play the video because it doesn't work very well on these Zooms, but I can play the audio. So Clyburn has said his hellos and greetings to everybody, and he's about to start talking. And one thing I'll just note, Clyburn has a Southern drawl, and it's a heavy drawl. So it might take you a minute, 30 to 45 seconds to kind of like catch up to his words.
I want to say a couple of things about why we're here. I was next door at Nan's breakfast and established an award in my wife's name, my late wife, and they decided that I should be the first recipient of that award. Emily was from the little town of Monk's Corner, where we met on South Carolina State's campus come March 15th, 60 years ago. I'll always remember that day because that was the first day that I was arrested. And I met her in jail on that day. About 18 months later, we were married. Stayed married for 58 years. We talked about this day that we love so much. I remember her telling about her experiences, walking 2.5 miles to school every morning, 2.5 miles back home every afternoon. A little 22-acre farm. She learned how to drive in a pickup truck. She came to South Carolina State in that pickup truck with her luggage on the bed. How her father would walk from Monk's Corner to Somerville to work in the off season, cutting pulpwood. We talked about what our parents sacrificed for us and what we owed to our children and all other children similarly situated. We often talked about the leadership of this country. And there's nobody who Emily loved as a leader in this country more than she loved Joe Biden. And we talked about Joe all the time. And so, as I was trying to make up my mind what I should do and when I should do it, I was informed that my accountant had passed away. His funeral was last Friday in the rural part of Richland County. I went to the funeral. I got there about 30 minutes early. And I was walking around speaking to people, many of whom I had not seen in a long time. And I spoke to them, and there was an elderly lady in her upper 80s sitting on the front pew of the church, just a few seats away from the coffin. And she looked at me and she beckoned to me. Didn't say a word, just beckoned. I went over to her. She says, lean down. I need to ask you a question. And I leaned down. And she said, you don't have to say it out loud. But you just whispered into my ear. Who are you going to vote for next Saturday? I've been waiting to hear from you. I need to hear from you. This community wants to hear from you. I decided then and there that I would not stay silent. Martin Luther King Jr., in his letter from Birmingham City Jail, wrote that he was coming to the conclusion that the people of ill will in our society was making a much better use of time than the people of goodwill. And he feared that we would regret, not just for the vitriolic words and deeds of bad people, but for the appalling silence of good people. The appalling silence of good people. I decided, after that experience last Friday with that elderly constituent and my background experiences and studies of Martin Luther King Jr., that I would break my silence today. And I've been saying to the media, I've known for a long time who I'm going to vote for. But I had not decided whether or not to share it with the public. But I want the public to know that I'm voting for Joe Biden. South Carolinians should be voting for Joe Biden, and here's why. There's billboards around this counter. On that billboard's my pledge. A lot of people ask me, why do you do billboards? Because my late wife said to me, I don't care how many TV ads you run, I don't care how many radio ads you run. When you run for office, I want to see billboards. That's why I do billboards. And just one of my colleagues came and says, this is the first time I've seen a political billboard with no picture on it. Why isn't your picture on the billboard? That's because it ain't about me.
That's right.
It's about the message on that billboard. And the message is simply this: making the greatness of this country accessible and affordable for all. We don't need to make this country great again. This country is great.
That's right.
That's not what our challenge is. Our challenge is making the greatness of this country accessible and affordable for all. If it's healthcare, is it accessible? Is it affordable? Education, is it accessible? Is it affordable? Housing, energy, making it accessible and affordable. And nobody with whom I've ever worked in public life is any more committed to that motto, that pledge that I have to my constituents than Joe Biden. Joe Biden and I used to spend a lot of time doing TV stuff together. We got to know each other. I know Joe. We know Joe. But most importantly, Joe knows us.
That's right. That's right.
That's important. Everybody think about Brown v. Board of Education. He may have started here in South Carolina, but Brown v. Board of Education, 5 cases. One was from South Carolina, one was from Virginia, one was from District of Columbia, one was from Kansas, but the fifth case was from Delaware. We have discussed thoroughly Gephardt, the Gephardt case from Delaware, and the Briggs case from South Carolina. That's how well I know this man. I know his heart. I know who he is. I know what he is. I know where this country is. We are at an inflection point. On that day that I met him, I went to jail around 10 o'clock in the morning, and I was discharged from jail, bailed out around 5:30 in the evening. When I sat in jail that day, I wondered whether or not we were doing the right thing, but I was never fearful for the future. As I stand before you today, I am fearful for the future of this country. I'm fearful for my daughters and their futures and their children and their children's future. This country is at an inflection point. It is time for us to restore this country's dignity, this country's respect. That is what is at stake here. And I can think of no one better suited, better prepared. I can think of no one with the integrity, no one more committed to the fundamental principles that make this country what it is, than my good friend, my late wife's great friend, Joe Biden.
That clip there with Jim Clyburn captures the intensity and the focus that he felt about endorsing and supporting Joe Biden. Ultimately, that endorsement by him proved monumentally important, and more than half of all voters in the South Carolina primary identified it as very important to their decision. All right. So here's what the pattern that we saw, and it's never been seen before in American politics. Never before, ever in the modern era have we seen this pattern where we look at the early states. All of those folks on the left side are people who went on to become presidents of the United States. Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump. There's a lot more candidates who ran. These are the ones that went on to become presidents of the United States. When you look at their successes in Iowa and New Hampshire, they had a lot of them. They had a lot of success. There's an asterisk with Carter because Carter was the first human in the polls and in the caucus in Iowa. But there's a category called none of the above that you can select, and that none of the above actually won in 1976. But Carter was the first human there. Bill Clinton didn't compete in Iowa because the favorite son, Tom Harkin, was running. So none of the candidates competed in Iowa in 1992. And Clinton came in second in New Hampshire, but I put it as secondst because he spun it as a victory and called himself the comeback kid because he was coming back from so many kind of scandals at that moment in his campaign. And he lost to Paul Tsongas there in New Hampshire. And Tsongas was the senator from next door, Massachusetts. And so Clinton really presented it as like he won in New Hampshire. And so everybody does well in these early states. Okay. Then when you look over at South Carolina, you actually see that all of them have won South Carolina. The way to see this is not that if you win South Carolina, you go on to be president. That's not the case. A lot of other people won South Carolina, went on, did not become president. Newt Gingrich in 2012 won South Carolina on the Republican side. definitely not president. John Kerry in 2004 won South Carolina, also not president. But the way to read this instead is that you have to win South Carolina if you're going to become president. And the reason you have to is because the dynamics that are on the ground in South Carolina, the coalitions that are put together on both sides of the parties, the Republicans and Democrats, are so symbolic and indicative of the national coalitions that those coalitions tell you something about whether the person can win in a general election. All right. Biden in 2020, 4th in Iowa, 5th in New Hampshire, but then wins in South Carolina. I don't know if he's going to be president, but he did what had to be done if you look at the pattern of who people who become president. And I pay attention to patterns as part of the kind of research professor in me, is I look at those patterns, and he did it. He got it done. All right. And African-American voters were at the core of it. When you look at South Carolina, you look at all voters and then African-Americans, the overall vote was almost identical to Nevada, but completely flipped. In Nevada, Sanders had 47 and Biden had 20. In South Carolina, it's Biden with 48 and Sanders with 20. And when you look at African-Americans, Biden had 61% of the vote among 60% of the voters, and Sanders had 17%. Sanders had 6% in 2016 in South Carolina, and it was described as a shellacking, a getting crushed by African-American voters there. And it began the run for Hillary Clinton to win among a number of states with large African-American populations. Here, Biden wins big. Sanders comes in actually second among African-American voters. Tom Steyer beats him in terms of the vote among African-Americans. Those numbers, though, that 60+% for Biden and that right around 20% for Sanders, become a pattern that is replicated across the country on Super Tuesday, which occurs 3 days later. Between the Saturday of South Carolina and the Tuesday of Super Tuesday, the reality is that African-American voters decide that Joe Biden is their candidate. Not all young African-American voters continue to support Bernie Sanders at high numbers, but when you look at the actual voting age distribution among African-Americans, voters under 30 are not a very high percentage among African-American voters. So when you look at the over 30, Biden is crushing it among them and does this all over the country. And he wins in all these states. He wins big in Virginia among African-Americans. He wins big in North Carolina among African-Americans, in Alabama, in Oklahoma, in the much smaller percentages, but still there, in Minnesota, in Maine, in Massachusetts. These voters do what they have done in the Democratic Party for the last almost 30 years. They decide who's going to be the nominee. And if you're able to pair that support with some other dimensions, then you can become a general election victor. So it's not enough. It's not a sufficient condition to become president, but it is an absolutely essential condition. In scientific terms, there are what are called necessary conditions and there are what are called sufficient conditions. A necessary condition is something that has to be present in order for an outcome to be achieved. A sufficient condition is something that doesn't have to be present, but if it is present, then the outcome is guaranteed to occur. For African-American voting support for winning in South Carolina, that is a necessary condition in American politics if you want to become president. It's not a sufficient condition, but it is a necessary condition to become president. Joe Biden, despite that narrative, despite all of his challenges in the campaign, got it done. Okay. All right. I'm going to come off of the screen I'm going to come off of that for a second and talk a little bit here. So, I've been studying American politics since when I went to graduate school in the early 1990s. And I have studied presidencies, in the presidential campaigns in particular. We've never seen a campaign that like Joe Biden's. 4th in Iowa, 5th in New Hampshire, 2nd in Nevada, 1st in South Carolina, and then sweeping 10 out of 14 states on Super Tuesday, and then sweeping states on the next Super Tuesday, including, he didn't win them all, but he won 5 out of 6 the following Tuesday, including this state of Washington. We've never seen this before. So, you know, the reality is that we've never seen a Trump either. We're in this span, we've never seen a pandemic in our lifetime like this either. All bets are off. Everything is fucking nuts. Okay. And Biden, in the midst of that incredible downslope, got the lifeline from Jim Clyburn and came back and began to put together. He has a chance because of that to put together the coalition. All right. So I want to move on to the next 2 dimensions for tonight to talk about those pieces. So, second, Joe Biden fuses his story with the American mythic story. And I saw this begin to happen in South Carolina. And I also saw it in Iowa, but it didn't have the authenticity and the confidence in Iowa that you began to see in South Carolina, where Joe Biden was home. Joe Biden found he went home essentially to South Carolina, to people who love him. And you could see him begin to insert himself into the American story and to find people that believed with him and would walk with him. And there's 3 particular ways that Biden did this in that span, that those couple of weeks that were instrumental. First, he began to present himself as resilient Joe. He couldn't do this until he began to come back. But once he began to come back, then he began to be someone who gets up off the mat, who gets knocked down but comes back. This is core to who Joe Biden is. But he hadn't had the ability in the political arena to kind of make the point because he hadn't come back yet. Now he gets to be resilient comeback Joe, all right? And he fuses that with this idea that America needs to come back. We need to come back from this incredibly difficult time that we're in, and that he can help make it happen. So we begin to get resilient Joe and America fused together in his arguments. Second, we begin to get decent and good Joe merged with this idea of decent and good America, and that he can help us to regain that decent and good America, and that he, decent and good Joe, can help become again decent and good America. So these 2 get to become intertwined again. All right. There's Joe and there's America, and he begins to put them together. All right. And then third, there's the all together Joe and America, that we're all in this together, that there's nobody who isn't in the boat together or on the bus together, that we're all in it together. And this position that we're all in it together is one of what drives progressives, of which there's many in Seattle. And I, in this particular instance, certainly see myself in this camp, drives them nuts about Joe, because Joe, like Barack Obama, never quits on Republicans. And he also sees kind of like this notion of the big tent, and he makes a lot of mistakes and gaffes, but he asks for grace just as he gives grace to people. And so there's the all together now Joe and America, or we might say all forward together. All right. These 3 things come together for Joe in South Carolina. Then he gets out on the road, trumpets it in the days after South Carolina as we go towards Super Tuesday. And he eventually finds it all together. And I was there, I think, the day that it really clicked for him. It was the Thursday, the day after Clyburn's endorsement. It was at a community center in Sumter, South Carolina, a small town, maybe like a Cle size. And Biden spoke to a couple, 300-400 people, predominantly African-American audience. There was about 5 or 6 from our group that had gone to see him at this event. And there was this moment in this event when, Joe Biden gave some remarks. Just one second. Good night, buddy. Love you, buddy. Sleep good. See you in the morning. Had to say good night to my son. No compromise on that for me. Biden does a Q&A at this event. And unlike Q&As that I see with a lot of other candidates, Biden just says, who has questions? And people start to raise their hands. This is a dangerous thing for candidates to do because you don't know what you're going to get. But Biden does it, and 20 hands go up in the room, and he ends up taking about 5 or 6 questions. And the last one he takes is from a woman who stands up and she says, I'm an undecided voter, Vice President, but I came today because I wanted to hear I wanted to see you in person and hear your positions, your thoughts. She said, I want you to know though that my son is not an undecided voter. He's 12, he can't actually vote, but you're his candidate. And you're his candidate because my son's father, my husband, passed away 6 or 7 years ago. And my son feels like you would understand that because of what you've suffered in your life. She said, so he's in your camp. And she said, and my husband now is also in your camp. And in fact, he briefed you when you went to Iraq in 2015. He delivered a briefing to you. And she said, and here's my husband is right here. And so he stands up and he's in his military fatigues, this guy. And she says, but I am an undecided voter. And I have a question for you, Mr. Vice President. She said, when I see Bernie Sanders and I see Elizabeth Warren and I see other candidates, I know why they're running for the presidency. I can tell. They have a certain fire in their belly. She said, I don't always get that from you. I don't know why you're running for president. Can you help me to understand why you're running for president? And you can imagine the dramatic dimension that this moment had in this room. The national press are all there watching this. In fact, when it was all over, they made a beeline over to talk to her. This dramatic moment, and Joe Biden was standing like from, it was not socially distanced, which wasn't a thing at the time. He was 5 or 6 feet away from her. And there was a long pause. And then he said, I am running to restore decency and dignity and honor to this country. That's why I'm running. And then he exhibited the fire in the belly. He roared. He spoke with volume. He spoke with passion about how it was that this president was destroying that, and that how he would fight, and that it was core to him as a person, as a human being, that this would be who he was. And the place went nuts. This place was just erupted. They were chanting, let's go, Joe. Let's go, Joe. And Biden didn't tend to get many chants at his events. They were going crazy. And it was as if the switch went off for Biden. You had this debate on Tuesday, the Clyburn endorsement on Wednesday. This event starts the day on Thursday. He begins to see himself as somebody who is resilient, as somebody who believes and wants to tell everybody that he will be decent and good, and that we're all in this together, all right? And so Biden, the night of South Carolina, gives an address where he delivers this message, and he makes the case about these dimensions. And so I want us to hear the last couple minutes of his speech that night, because you can hear these pieces and fuse it. You can see them all fused together, and we're going to see these all the way through this election. All right. This is the 3-part story, along with coronavirus and his leadership around that. This is the story that is Joe Biden. It's how he won the nomination, and it's going to be how he also, if he wins the general election. So I'm going to play this clip now. Gonna pop the microphone down so it's right next to the audio. Oops. We're gonna get to Elizabeth Warren in a second.
It works. Rewards work, not just wealth. My dad used to say, Joey, a job's about a lot more than the paycheck. It's about your dignity. It's about decency, it's respect. It's about your place in the community. It's being able to look your kid in the eye and say, honey, it's going to be okay. For all our families, for all our communities. Because that's the right thing to do. That's what makes us Democrats. Talk is cheap. False promises are deceptive. And talk about revolution and changing anyone's life. We need real changes right now. Something I've done my whole career, and I'll do as president. But this is an election to spend all our time in a battle for the soul of the Democratic Party. This is a battle for the soul of the United States of America.
I'm coming back.
We're in an incredibly perilous moment, as all of you know. Winning means uniting America, not sowing more division and anger. It means not only fighting, but healing the country. We have to beat Donald Trump and the Republican Party, but here's the deal. We can't become like them. We can't become like them. We can't have a never-ending war. Above all, it's time for America to get back up. The country is so ready. So ready. Once again, fight for the proposition that we hold these truths to be self-evident. That all men and women are created equal, endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights. We say it all the time, but we've never fully lived up to it. But we've never before, until this president, walked away from it. And it's the reason why Jim and I and all of us are in this. I believe with every fiber of my being that all men and women are created equal. You know, I saw it a few days ago in a town hall in Charleston, Jim. I spoke with Reverend Anthony Thompson, whose wife, Myra, was studying the words of her Bible with 8 other parishioners at Mother Emanuel 4.5 years ago. It was a weekly routine, reading scripture and finding purpose and faith in God and in each other. And in an instant, hate, vengeance, white supremacy pierced that faith, and they were lost forever. But you know what I found the most remarkable thing in my career thus far? Remarkable about Reverend Thompson and the families of the Emanuel 9. It's through all that pain, yes, all that grief, they forgave. Yes, sir. Yes. And here's the deal. In their forgiveness, they brought more change to South Carolina than any that's occurred over the previous 100 years. Think about it. The Confederate flag came down. Real change. That's why the Sunday after, Jill and I and my family, we came back to Mother Emanuel on Sunday services after the funeral of the victims. Because 6 weeks earlier, we had lost our son, Bo. And we needed to be healed too. We need to be healed. I really mean this. We needed whatever they were exuding. And with every season that's passed, they've gotten up and found purpose to live life worthy of the ones they lost, worthy of the blessings to live in this remarkable country. We left here having arrived in overwhelming pain, thinking we can do this. We can get through this. So I want to tell you, it's no small reason why I'm in this race. People like all of you here tonight, all around the country, the days of Donald Trump's divisiveness will soon be over. No. And as Jim quoted into Tocqueville, he was right. This multi-ethnic country we call our democracy, America, it can't survive unless we focus on our goodness. We can build a more perfect union because the American people in the last 3.5 years have seen the alternative. No, I really mean it. Think about it. They've seen how utterly mean, selfish, lack of any sense of empathy or concern for anybody else. A president who not only has horrible policies, but the way he mocks and makes fun of other people. To all of you here in South Carolina, and especially Jim Clyburn, my friend, who lifted me and this campaign on his shoulders. That's right. But I mean all of you. Many I don't have time to name, all of you. We, Jill and I, our daughter Ashley, my son Hunter has been on the phone straight through for me. My brothers, my sister, my two brothers, my sister, my five grandchildren, my four granddaughters who've come out on the campaign trail. We'll never forget what you've done for us. Well, we can say without fear of contradiction, the Bidens love you guys, man. The Bidens love you. That's real. And folks, now we need to stand behind Jamie Harrison, the next president, next senator of South Carolina. We need to send Joe Cunningham back to the House of Representatives. All of us, all the Bidens, thank you. Thank you for everything you've done for us. So folks, so here's the deal. Let's get back up. We're decent, we're brave, we're resilient people. We can't believe again. We're better than this moment. We're better than this president. So get up, take back our country. This is the United States of America. There's nothing beyond our capacity if we do it together. God bless you all, and may God protect our troops. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy to hear him because tremendous intensity and focus there, and not always something we've seen from Joe Biden, but he found it. He found it in South Carolina, and his merger together of his story with the American story. And I want to move then to the reaction of others who talk about Joe Biden. Elizabeth Warren, when she dropped out on March 5th, did an interview with Rachel Maddow in which she said this about Joe Biden. So we go back a long way. We were in the bankruptcy wars against each other. When he was vice president, I got to do some work with him. He is exactly, at least this is my view, Warren said, he is exactly who he says he is. He's a decent guy. I mean that in the good sense of decency. And it comes through in pretty much everything he does. Okay. All right. I encourage you to watch that interview, which is the night she left the suspended her campaign. She goes on to talk at length about Bernie Sanders and the Sanders campaign, and it is not what she says about the Biden campaign. Okay. Then Warren was asked on April 15th, just 2 weeks ago, in a short interview with Rachel Maddow, she was asked another question. So I'm going to play this. This is just a minute long.
You know me. You know what I've been fighting for all of my career, so that hardworking people across this country get a real chance, and that opportunity doesn't just go to a handful of folks at the top, but really does go to everybody in this country, and that we make the investments to make that happen. My conversations with Joe Biden long predate this presidential race. They predate the 2016. We've had a lot of conversations about how we build an America going forward, with lots of different pieces and parts to that. Now that I'm no longer in the presidential race, I had a chance to resume a lot of those and to start a bunch of new ones. Because look, we both want the same thing. We want this country to work, and we want it to work for everyone. So I'm in this fight to help in any way I can, to help on the policy front, to help by getting out there and talking about it, to help by telling people, go to joebiden.com, pitch in your $5, send some text, volunteer some time. Because it truly is the case. We are all in this now. And we have seen the importance of having a leader that we can count on in a crisis. It's not Donald Trump. It is Joe Biden.
If he asked you to be his running mate, would you say yes?
Yes.
I am so happy you just gave me a concise answer to that.
There you go. A one-word answer from Elizabeth Warren. Would she be vice presidential candidate? Would she be the nominee? Number two thing that helped Joe Biden to win the nomination then, and that can help him to win, is this story. This story, Joe Biden needed to become the underdog. That's who Joe Biden is. As he became in that space, he could get back up. And this is the guy who knows how to get back up in difficult moments. He has fused that with his story about what America is. This is powerful stuff. It's not a sufficient condition to win the presidency, but it is a necessary condition to win the presidency. Every great candidate has a story that fuses themselves and puts themselves, inserts themselves into the story of America. Barack Obama did it all the time. Said his story is only possible in the United States of America, with a mother from Kansas and a father from Kenya. I don't think that's true, that his story is only possible in the United States of America, but he put it in the fabric of the American mythology. That's what winning presidential candidates do. All right, last part for tonight. What also happened in those crucial weeks and is important for the general election is that center and center left voters united. In the Democratic Party, there's roughly kind of three lanes. There's centrists, there's center lefts, and there's progressive lefts. The progressive left folks were Sanders and Warren. The center left folks were kind of Klobuchar, Buttigieg, O'Rourke, Biden, and they were kind of there. And they certainly all phase a little bit towards the center too. There's nobody really past center left that was still in the candidacy at this time. But where those center and center left voters were going to go was very divided in the first couple of weeks of the campaign of the voting. But then after South Carolina, Pete Buttigieg drops out, Amy Klobuchar drops out, Beto O'Rourke, who'd already dropped out, reemerges. They all endorse Joe Biden in the space of one evening, a couple hours. They endorse him and say, vote for him. They help in Minnesota for Klobuchar's, her support helps Biden to win in Minnesota. O'Rourke, no question, helps the success of Biden in Texas. Buttigieg begins to put his kind of stamp of moderatism, and he will be back. There's no question about it. Puts his stamp on it with Joe Biden too. That's monumentally important. And writing 1 week later, Elaine Godfrey in The Atlantic puts it in these terms. A deluge of voters, including many in the suburbs, filed into churches and community centers across the country to vote for a moderate candidate in an act they viewed as a repudiation of the president. This is what happened in 2018, and it happened again on Super Tuesday. Joe Biden's victory suggests that many voters are thinking and acting much like they did in the previous midterm elections, when Democrats, thanks to historically high turnout, flipped 41 congressional districts and regained control of the House. In fact, Joe Biden's endorsements prior to Super Tuesday, he overwhelmingly had members of Congress, the folks in Congress who were endorsing Biden. He is the one out of all the remaining candidates who was getting the endorsements from those sitting members of Congress, Democrats, often in competitive districts, competitive states, that they wanted him at the top of the ticket. They wanted the more moderate voice. So what the Democratic Party voters in the center and the center left did is what the Republican Party did not do in 2016. They came together and said, we want this candidate and we are large enough to win this nomination. This becomes really important when we get to the general election. This is the Gallup time trend of people's political identifications over the last 30 years. And the red line is going to be total percent of people identifying as conservative. The gray line is going to be the percent identifying as moderate. And the blue line is going to be the percent identifying as liberal. This is not in the Democratic Party. This is all Americans who identify in these different who identify with these different terms. And behind the terms, of course, are certain worldviews. So I just want to give you a sense of where these numbers are at in the American political landscape. So liberals are actually, more people are identifying as liberal. You know, they're up 10% 10 points from 1992 to today. But liberals are not enough to win the presidency. They are not. You need liberals and moderates. Conservatives start at a much stronger position. They need to peel away fewer moderates to win the presidency. This is a stronger electoral position in the United States. Liberals can't do it by themselves. Liberals have to build coalitions with moderates. And this is part of the real challenge for the Democratic Party. Moderates, though, are right where conservatives are. They are a large block of voters. And in the Democratic Party, when those voters came together after South Carolina, or beginning with South Carolina and then through Super Tuesday, they took control of the Democratic primary. They too will have tremendous influence as we go forward in the general election. And Biden is their candidate. It could have been Klobuchar, it could have been Buttigieg, but eventually it became Biden. All right. So last little bit here. Let's just see how important these voters are. Let's go back to 2016 and let's look at exit polls in 2016. Among people voting in 2016, Clinton got 89% of people who identify as Democratic. That's what you would expect. And Trump got 88% of folks who identified as Republicans. But it was Trump who won independents. Not by a ton, but they don't need a ton as Republicans. They don't need a ton. They peel off a little bit, and that was enough. So this is part of the way that Trump won in those crucial battleground states in the Midwest. So how about today in 2020? Well, I want to take two polls from last week, the YouGov/Economist poll and the AP Ipsos poll that looks at these same parties. This is from last week. You look at Joe Biden support, he's getting 87% of Democrats in one poll, 85% in the other. That's pretty much where Clinton's at. Note that these numbers don't add up to 100 in any case, because there's always some third-party votes in 2016, or there's some unknowns right now. Among Republicans, Trump's support is even stronger in the YouGov poll, but it's not quite as strong in the Ipsos poll. We'll see. I'm assuming it's going to be quite strong when we get to the election. But what about independents? Where are they at right now? It's not overwhelming by any means, but they are leaning Biden. They are leaning Biden, okay? And today, USA Today and Suffolk University released their poll, a national poll. And they don't make all of their data available, but they did in their story write-up share the position of independents in this poll, all right? And the independent distribution is this, all right? I don't pay any attention to any single poll, but I look for patterns. I look for patterns in election outcomes. I look for patterns in polling data. And right now, Joe Biden has more support of independents than Donald Trump. That is enough to win the presidency. Now we're getting into sufficient conditions. That could win the presidency as long as he holds that Democratic support. So center and center left voters are united. Next week, I'll take this up and dive into some battleground states. When we look at kind of the electoral map specifically, I'll look not only at independent voters, but in specific battleground states. This is national data today. I want to finish here with this. So this is a piece that ran in the Washington Post yesterday. Sean Sullivan wrote this, and it's a story about how the US Senate is starting to tilt towards the Democrats, and it's tied to Joe Biden's position. Here's the quote. Biden's ascent has dented GOP plans to paint Democratic candidates as left-wing extremists, something they were eager to do had Senator Bernie Sanders emerged as the nominee. Instead, Democrats now have a more moderate standard bearer who is intimately familiar with the Senate, in close touch with top candidates, and keenly aware of how Senate control could affect his potential presidency. The former vice president's emergence is part of a larger shift in prospects that has become clear in Arizona, Colorado, North Carolina, and even Montana and Georgia. Even in Alabama, one of the most conservative states, underdog Senator Doug Jones, a Democrat, stands an outside chance of an upset. Biden campaigned for Jones in 2017, and Jones and said he hopes Biden will campaign for him again in 2020. I'm going to come off of the screen share now. You can't see that quote anymore, the quote that was up there, but you remember the last sentence. Doug Jones stands an outside chance in Alabama. And he said that, and he was quoted as saying, hey, I'm glad Biden's the nominee. I didn't give you that quote, but he does say that in another part of the story. And that he hopes Biden will campaign for him again in 2020. The last time a Democratic presidential candidate campaigned for a Democratic statewide candidate in Alabama is Bill Clinton. Okay? There has been no Democratic presidential candidate invited by a Democratic statewide candidate in Alabama to come and campaign for him in a presidential year since then, because the Democratic brand doesn't play well statewide. And the last thing you need to do is rile up the Republicans. But Biden's center-left position was a valuable piece for Doug Jones in 2017. And Jones wants Biden back in 2020. That's something, it's stunning, really. There's no way that Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren or Hillary Clinton was somebody that would have been or was welcomed. They were not. They were not welcomed, and they wouldn't have been welcomed in Alabama. So Joe Biden, with his center and center-left coalition, can win the presidency. He can. When you put together these three things, you put together the support of African-American voters, if he's able to retain that. And we know the vice presidential candidate is going to matter for that. I will talk a little bit about that next time, and I'm thinking about doing a couple other lectures down the road and later in May about the vice presidency. But if he can hold that support, plus keep that message around the fusion of himself, his story in America, and I don't think there's any way that he will morph out of his ideological position, which is center left, then he's got the makings of a position, of an approach that can win the presidency. There's a long way to go. A long way to go. But the ingredients are there. And that is factually correct. Next lecture, next week on Monday, I will talk about the coronavirus and what it means for leadership and the characteristics of Donald Trump and Joe Biden, what it means for the two of them as they pursue the presidency. Between now and then is a lifetime. In politics, I don't even know where we'll be around the coronavirus then, in terms of what stupid things Trump might be doing, and we don't know where Joe Biden will be at on a series of things as well. So we'll pick that up next week. Really appreciate you all joining us tonight. I'm going to take a look now and do a couple of question and answers for folks who've left some questions in the Zoom. But otherwise, I just want to say thank you all for joining this. It's an honor for me to have the chance to speak to you all on this monumentally important election circumstances. All right. Okay. Question about South Carolina that I want to address. Why is South Carolina so important to Democrats if it is, at least from this person's impression, pretty consistently a red state? It is a red state overall, but on the Democratic part, and so it votes, when you get to like the overall aggregate of the vote, it is more Republican, far more Republican than Democratic. But when you look at the coalition of Democratic voters in the state, and you just look at the primary, who votes in the primary, the kind of crucial pieces are there is that you have working class whites, you have African American voters, and you have a mix of some highly educated, wealthier whites along the coast. That pretty much is the Democratic coalition, along with Latinx voters. So you have to be able to put those pieces together in the general election to win the presidency. So winning the primary for the Democrats in South Carolina doesn't mean that Joe Biden's going to win South Carolina. He's not. But winning the primary there tells us that he can put that coalition together generally across the country, that he has the chance to do it. That's why it's such a predictive measure for the Democrats. On the Republican side, it's so predictive in the primary because you have national security conservatives, you have social conservatives, and you also have economic conservatives. And the Republican candidate to win the primary there has to put that coalition together to win the primary. And they have to put that coalition together to win nationally. So on each side of the political aisle in South Carolina, you have the party coalitions that are really can be generalized to the whole United States and can win. That's why it's such a predictive entity. Like if you can't win there, it's hard to see you putting together the coalition on a national scale. Let's see. Do I think Bernie Sanders can be brought along to support Biden? Will Biden embrace some of Bernie's progressive ideas to make that happen? I think that there are really two classes, and this isn't my take. This is what I read from others and hear from others, including an incredible podcast that I'm going to be sharing with colleagues in Common Purpose that was on Vox Media about 2 weeks ago, talking with one of the founders of Data for Progress, in which they talk about two kinds of Bernie supporters. There's the progressives that are in it for the movement and the cause, and they understand that they're not getting their candidate is only part of the journey, that they continue to fight for what they want, and that even though Biden's not their candidate, they will get behind him because there's a broader movement that they want to advance. And then there's another class of folks that will never vote for Joe Biden. They weren't going to vote for anybody in the Democratic nomination of the finalists, except for maybe Elizabeth Warren. And even there, it got a little testy. So I really don't spend a lot of time thinking about the second class because they're not, those voters are making choices that that to me are not part of the broader, it is a privileged position to be able to say, I'm not going to vote for Joe Biden in this election. And I don't exist in that. Although I do have those privileges as a human being, to me, I recognize that the case is that he's, worlds better than Donald Trump. So the folks who are Bernie and Elizabeth Warren supporters, I think, who are open to the reality that the fight is long and every election is a step in the right direction and the movement is different than an election, will be there. I believe they'll be there. And I think that the relationship between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden, which to me, I put entirely on the shoulders, in a positive way, entirely on the shoulders of Joe Biden, that Joe Biden has built those kinds of relationships with all kinds of people in Congress that others don't get along with. Bernie Sanders is not well liked in the Senate. He's not despised, but he doesn't have a lot of friends. He's a loner. But Joe Biden has been friends with him for a long time, and those friendships matter. And Biden, I think, has done a really good job of letting Sanders kind of make his choices of when to depart, and he's reaching out to him. And I think that we're going to see some of Sanders's ideas we are seeing some of them adopted along the way. So I think some of them will come along. The ones who won't, I don't think they're going to determine this election. I think the people that determine this election are the same voters that voted in 2018 and determined that election. These are suburban white women and African-American and Latinx voters. They are the crucial voters in this election, not white left progressives. Let's see. Can I address how Biden and Trump support will be affected by remote campaigning? Who will it hurt the most? What should Biden's remote strategy be? Sure. I know there's this great angst that's out there about Biden. Like, where is the guy? Where is he? But behind the scenes, Joe Biden is exactly where people who are strategically running these campaigns want him to be. Modestly in the discussion, but not doing a lot. Here's why that's so valuable. One, we know Joe Biden makes mistakes and struggles with his words and says things and gets into trouble. And so we don't need him to get into trouble in doing that. Second, Joe Biden is a known quantity. Joe Biden is not unknown to the American public. He's not Pete Buttigieg, who's, 40% of the public didn't know who Pete Buttigieg was or have an opinion of him, even at the end of the Democratic primary. Joe Biden, 8 years of vice president, 30 years before that, a senator. He's a known quantity. That quantity, there's generally a positive view of him in the American public. Let's just let that view be there. The remote and let Trump do his terrible things and Biden just looks better all the time. As we go forward in remote campaigning, I will say this in general, and I will be talking about this in my voting lectures that are coming up. The Democrats are far better positioned for remote campaigning than the Republicans are. Far, far better. And I will unpack that as we go forward in the voting rights lectures that start next Tuesday, not tomorrow, but the following Tuesday. Let's see, what role did Obama play in Biden's breakthrough in South Carolina and since? I think there's no question that behind the scenes, Barack Obama has been very important. He is beloved among South Carolinians. There is a common reality in South Carolina that in African-American homes, there is a picture of John Kennedy. There's a picture of Barack Obama, and there's a picture of Kennedy, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Barack, maybe Barack by himself or Barack and Michelle Obama. And behind the scenes, that support was enormous. And I think that we have seen enough stories now to know that Obama played a role in kind of moving Klobuchar, Buttigieg, and O'Rourke towards supporting Biden once Biden won in South Carolina. And I think the Obamas are going to be so important in this election, monumentally important. All right, maybe do one or two more questions here. To what degree do I anticipate Biden pivoting to the center now that we're into the general election? So let me say that again. To what degree do I anticipate Biden pivoting to the center politically now that we're into the general election? I don't think that's going to happen at all. I think he's actually going to run a little bit to the left because he wants to win over some of the Warren supporters. I think that, you know, if he picks a Kamala Harris or Stacey Abrams or Elizabeth Warren and not Amy Klobuchar for his vice presidential candidate, then to me that's an indication that he wants to run a little bit, not a whole lot, but a little bit to the left. I think that he already has the center. What he needs to get is a little bit more progressive. And I think we're seeing that on student debt. We're seeing that on some of his discussions around healthcare and kind of the steps that he wants to take on that. And I think we're seeing that on his embrace of climate change. It's very meaningful to me that Jay Inslee has endorsed Joe Biden, and that he didn't just endorse Joe Biden, but that he said that beyond a shadow of a doubt, he believes Joe Biden will be fighting and will make battling against climate change a centerpiece of his campaign. I think that Joe Biden has the potential to be a very progressive candidate, progressive president. And let's be clear that where he exists right now, he is already to the left of where Barack Obama was in 2008, 2012 on healthcare, on education, on climate change. He is to the left. He is the most progressive major party presidential candidate that we've had in the last 40 years. So he's not like non-progressive. He just isn't as progressive as some of the people he was running against. And that was the challenge he had. I do not have a preference for vice presidential pick right now. Somebody asked about that. All right, let's see. One more question here, or I'll do two more. To what extent and how might international players help Biden versus Trump? I think there's this rule of thumb in politics that international players do not intervene in politics. However, we're in uncharted waters. We've never been in this position. Will Angela Merkel speak out on behalf of Biden? I think what we're going to see is we're going to have people talking about how much they respect Vice President Biden. This is one of the great strengths that Biden has over Trump, is his foreign policy kind of stature. So I think that we're going to have them put their thumb on the scale, nothing explicitly, but they will be clearly welcoming him as he makes some kind of trip internationally. Or if he can't make a trip, there'll be some kind of pomp and circumstance that shows their willingness and readiness to work with Biden. All right, let's see. Do you have any comments? Do I have any comments about the Biden campaign and digital efforts at campaigning? I understand they've come along slowly in this area. That's my understanding also, that the Trump campaign is much farther ahead on its digital campaigning. But I saw David Plouffe, he was on MSNBC either last night or the night before, the guy who, the person who ran the Obama campaign in 2008. And he said that this period of time is a actual gift to the Biden campaign, because they're having to develop their muscle, their digital muscle, and that they're really getting this built up. And separate from Plouffe, I would say that the reality is that the digital/remote work that's happening around the country among groups like A Common Purpose, like the Democrats in Wisconsin and Maine and other places that we're supporting, that they are ramping this up substantially. Again, this will be part of what I'll be talking about in the voting rights lectures. The reality that digital campaigning and supporting voting and voting actions in this election is going to have to be able to be done digitally and remotely. I think that I'm going to wrap it here. Again, thank you all so much for coming and for being part of this. I will plan to see you next Tuesday. And you can, if you want to bring other people to this, they can contact me and they can still register, but the brown paper tickets is closed. I will send out a note later. Tomorrow, I will send out the recording of this to everybody, the link to it. And I will send out a note later this week with the information about signing up for the voting rights lectures if you want to see that. Otherwise, I will plan to see you in a week. Be safe, okay? And be well. Take care, everybody.